Welcome to Truth Telling with Elizabeth D'Alto, the podcast dedicated to focusing on the truth that is always evolving within us and around us, where we explore the potentiality of truth as a highly esteemed value at a time in history when most people have more on their plates than any one human should. If you're new to me, full expression is my jam. Some words people have used to describe me range from speaker, trainer, coach, healer, writer, spiritual advisor, teacher, podcaster, and someone even called me their soul Sherpa once. I'm less concerned with titles or labels and more interested in results, change, and creating a world we want to, can, and are proud to live in. A kinder, gentler, more curious, collaborative, reverent world where people respect each other's backgrounds, experiences, and truths. They trust in themselves, in life, and recognize that we need each other. And they know how to cultivate healthy relationships to true power, not the very unhealthy kind of power our current culture is predicated upon. Speaking of our culture, there's a lot of noise and ignorance in our current culture, and this show aims to cut through that by exploring the truths of a diverse range of incredible voices. From authors, artists, creatives, and educators to activists, speakers, and those in various scientific and esoteric fields, our guests hail from cultures and countries all over the world. We post a new interview every Monday, and if you want to keep up with the show notes and quotes from our guests, you can follow me on Instagram at Elizabeth D'Alto. You can expect a wide range of topics when you tune into this show. Everything from health, communication, money, success, parenting, desire, sex, love, and spirituality, to making pivots and transitions in life, and topics related to psychology, storytelling, gender and race issues, emotional intelligence, activism, advocacy, and much more. A few disclaimers. No episode of the show is meant for everyone, and every episode is meant for whoever needs it on the right day at the right time. Not all guest views will reflect my own, and that's intentional. We don't learn, grow, heal, or improve by staying in our comfortable bubbles with all of our people who look, think, or live exactly how we do. If you love what you hear and find it useful and inspiring, the best way to show your appreciation is to share the episode, subscribe to the show, and leave us a rating and review wherever you listen in from. Thank you so much for being here with me. Here we go. Welcome to Truth Telling with Elizabeth D'Alto. Today we have Dr. T. Williams with us. Dr. T holds both master's and doctoral degrees in social justice education, and I really appreciate his way of taking complex and challenging topics and presenting them in ways that are easy to understand and work with. I also really enjoyed being able to learn and correct some of my own thinking, framing, and verbiage in real time during this conversation. We covered a lot of ground, including cognitive dissonance and how we fight against each other's oppression, the us versus it mentality instead of us versus them, why he prefers liberation work over anti-anything work, how we survive in environments that are constantly hurting us, the role of shame, blame, and guilt in oppression, intersectionality, and more. This is a good learning episode to share with friends and to use for discussion. The show notes can be found over at untameyourself.com/TT-278. Again, that's untameyourself.com/T as in truth, T as in telling -278. And for those of you who follow me on social media or are on our mailing list, you have probably already heard me mention that on November 23rd, coming up in a couple weeks here, if you're listening in real time, I'm going to be re-releasing my Wild Soul Movement virtual program under a brand new name, as well as releasing the workshop schedule for Wild Soul Movement workshops in 2019. I'm running 12 workshops next year, including 2 in Australia, 1 in the UK, 1 in Canada, and then 8 cities across the US. So if you've been wanting to come out to a workshop, get a chance to spend some time with me in real life, meet some women like you who loved listening to the show. My last workshop in Asheville, every single woman was a fan of the podcast. So if you want to come to a place where you know that you will have things in common with the rest of the people in the room, check it out. Keep an eye out for that. You can get on the wait list to be notified immediately when those things become available at wildsoulmovement.com/waitlist. And if you are on top of things, you might have realized that that is, Black Friday, Small Business Saturday, Cyber Monday weekend. So checking things out on that weekend will definitely save you some money. All right, y'all, I'm super excited for those things, and let's get into today's show. What's up, everybody? I'm super psyched for today's guest, Dr. T. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I have to give a shout out to my friend Jill Coleman. Jill's been on the podcast before. Jill's the one who told me about you like a month or two ago, because we were talking about, the nature of this episode will be around doing social justice work, to just throw a blanket generalization over it. Mm-hmm. And, Jill and I were talking about, wanting to learn from people who do this in a really compassionate but deep way. Mm-hmm. That keeps people engaged. And then that is how your name came up. So for people listening or watching, we had kind of like a preamble conversation a couple weeks ago, a get to know you. And I took all these notes. I usually don't have notes going into an interview. It's usually a free-flowing conversation. But in that offline chat, we talked about so many things, and I was like, oh my God. So I have a bunch of notes today, like a geek. So before we dive into all that, though, the first question I ask everyone is, what is a truth that's having a big impact on your life right now?
I think the biggest truth that's having an impact on my life right now is that men are lacking. And so what I mean by that is that there's a lot happening as it pertains to sexism and misogyny and men's violence toward women and sexual violence and all of these things. And there's one set of men who are, consciously engaging in these practices and embedding them within the institutions that they are part of. And then there are other sets of men who are bystanders. These men are watching. These men are sort of consciously or unconsciously participating in ways that are not as overt, but nevertheless participating. And it's deeply, deeply disturbing. Yeah. And even those men who are saying, hey, women are your sisters and your mom and your friends and all of those things, I understand that. But first and foremost, women are people. Mm-hmm. And so I shouldn't need to define a woman by their relationship to men in order to see their value and understand why it's important that we interrupt sexism and interrupt misogyny and call men out and call men in and do all the things that we need to do in order to contribute to not just women's liberation, but men's liberation as well.
I love this point, because one of the things, as I've been learning more in this area, is sometimes people will say things like non-white. And I'm like, why does it need to be in relationship to whiteness? You know what I mean? But that's how dominant culture works. It's so irritating, and it's so interesting once you've the goggles are off, which for me is much newer. I know you've been doing this for decades. You shared last time we talked. It's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like once you begin to become aware, you can't unsee what you learn to see. And the thing about dominant culture is that you learn that you are the center of your world, right? So white people learn that, men learn that, heterosexual people learn that, and all of those intersections. And so what that means is, of course, you define someone by how they are related to you, because you're the center of the world. That's how it works.
Did you ever watch the show 30 Rock?
Not really. I didn't get too much into it, no.
I'm rewatching it, and I'm cracking up. There was an episode the other day. Do you know who the actor John Hamm is from Mad Men?
I do. Yeah, I do.
So there was an episode where the main character in 30 Rock is Liz Lemon, and it's Tina Fey. And she's just this super awkward woman, and so she's dating John Hamm, who's obviously super handsome. I mean, subjectively, but pretty obvious to a lot of people. And there's this whole episode that totally speaks to this in a really funny way. She basically goes through the whole way that he lives in a bubble. Like they're at a restaurant and she covers his face with the menu and asks a question, and the waitress is super nasty to her. And then he's like, wait, where's the free appetizer plate? And why did she ask you if you needed this, this, and this? And she's like, because that only happens to you. Super handsome white guy. They go to play tennis and he's awful at tennis, but women are asking him oh, do you give lessons? She basically shows him, she pops the bubble. She's like, I'm sorry to do this for you, but things are very different for you. And it was kind of this hyperbolic way of really speaking to a very real thing, and a lot of isms, right? White, male, super attractive, and going through the world quite different for that experience than, you know, Liz Lemon's character, who's like still white, female, thin, not unattractive by like societal norms or whatever, but it did it in a really, really funny way.
You know, Eddie Murphy back in the day did a skit on Saturday Night Live where he did the same thing. He put on makeup and like fake hair and a fake mustache and became white.
I remember
and
this.
Then he walked around the world, you know, and pretending to be white and had like a fundamentally different experience. I think that was one of the first times that I was introduced to this notion of white privilege, right? I didn't know what that was when I recognized it and I understood the point that he was making, but I didn't have the language to articulate that that's what that was.
Yeah. So one of the things when you and I talked the other week that I really wanted to make sure we spent some time on here was the cognitive dissonance in the ways in which we actually fight against each other's oppression. Can you get into that?
So I have a habit of saying profound things once and then forgetting them. So I have no idea what you're talking about.
And you know what I was realizing too? I'm like, this is also my note that made sense in my brain.
Let
me ask the question in a different way, and you can take it wherever you want to. Where do you see cognitive dissonance being most either problematic or unproductive and unhelpful? Like, where is it happening that's really preventing people from moving forward into like deeper learning, progress, better behavior?
Well, first, let me ask you, have any more context on how that came up? Because cognitive dissonance is sort of a fundamental experience in human psychology when two things that don't fit in the same space at the same time come together, right? So musically, dissonance is when two notes are played that don't harmonize. And so it sounds like nails on a chalkboard to those of us who are sort of musically inclined, right? So cognitive dissonance is the idea. So I'll give you an example. I'll tell you a story. I think this is how it came up, actually. So I was not always the person doing the social justice things. I'm originally from the South Side of Chicago, and I'm heterosexual, so I received a certain kind of socialization. And part of that socialization was being homophobic. So I was a graduate student. I did a master's in organizational leadership at Gonzaga before I went to UMass. And while I was there, I did this training of trainers with this woman named Dr. Cindy Gallagher. And she was just amazing. And she knew more about racism than anyone I had ever met in my entire life. And she was 6 feet tall, and she was white, and she was a woman. She had like super bright red hair. She didn't take anybody's shit, and she was also a lesbian. And so I fell in love with her and who she was. Not like a romantic love, but like, this is my people's love, you know? Like, I just adored her completely. And I still had a lot of internalized homophobia. And so the training we did, this training of trainers around social justice stuff, it was very comprehensive. And it was the first time that I had been in a situation where I needed to reflect on my privileged identities. Because for me, my most salient identity, that is the identity that is most important to me, and the lens through which I look out into the world, was being Black. And that's an area that I'm targeted. And that's what most humans do, right? We look upon the world through the lens through which we are targeted, not where we have privilege. So in that experience, I was probably an asshole. At this point, it was decades ago. I don't really remember. But I do remember it at that point in my life being fairly judgmental and thinking I knew all the things and all of that kind of stuff. However, at the end of this training, I had this profound sense of cognitive dissonance. And that is, I had this very deep love and admiration for Cindy, who was just phenomenal and who modeled what this work looked like on one hand. And then on the other hand was my socialization, where I was taught that being gay was wrong, and just all the things that go with that. And so, as you can imagine, trying to hold space for both of those things simultaneously is a very uncomfortable experience. It's, those two thoughts don't gel very well. And so at the end of that training, I decided to take some responsibility for my own learning. I read what I could. I did the research that I could. And I was out of my depth, quite frankly, in terms of trying to wrap my head around both heterosexism, but also my own internalized stuff. So I sat down. I asked Cindy if she would be willing to have a conversation with me. And she said, sure, I'll have a conversation with you, which is very gracious of her. And I will forever love her for this because it changed the trajectory of my life. So we sat down and we had this conversation. And I don't remember most of the context of the conversation. I don't know. I know it was very uncomfortable, but there's one thing she said to me that really blew my mind. And she said, I don't care whether you approve, quote unquote, of my lifestyle or not. But if it is your expectation that I, as a white woman, fight against your oppression, then it is my expectation that you, as someone who is heterosexual, fight against my oppression. I think I messed that up, but you get the point, right?
Yeah.
She was talking about the very basic premise of allyship. I fight for you, you fight for me. That's the basis. That's the most basic you can get. That's even before you get to the point where there's no fighting for you and me, because all of these things are twisted up and bound together. So we're always fighting for ourselves and each other, period. So when she said that, I just remember stopping and needing a moment to process what she said. And I got stuck there. And I think why I got stuck there is because I had this big knot of stuff in my head that I was trying to untangle. And there were things that I was trying to understand. And that very basic notion was just like a big old sword cutting straight through the knot. It just got right to the heart of it.
Yes.
And with that, I was able to let go of a lot of the stuff that I've internalized. Mm-hmm. And what I realized is that at this point, I was in my very early 20s. At this point, what I realized is that there are some things that I'm carrying that are not consciously mine. These are things that I did not choose for myself. They were given to me. And what I found is that when I took the time to inventory my personal beliefs, what was mine, what I consciously chose, it did not align with the ways that I was socialized. And so in that sense, that cognitive dissonance, it's kind of, it happens a lot to people. Well, let me finish the story before I get into that.
Yeah.
So the story goes, we had that conversation and I was like stumped by this very basic premise. And, I spent weeks thinking about it, and we had another conversation. I was like, hey, listen, you're 100% right. And I don't know what to do next, but I'm going to do something because I'm with you. Let's ride. Let's do this. So basically, I asked her, like, where did you learn all of these things? And she said, over there at UMass. So UMass had the nation's first social justice education program. And as soon as I graduated from Gonzaga, I applied to that program, got accepted, and it was a done deal. So that's how I went from really sort of being entrenched in some of my own stuff to starting this journey of evolving into a different person. But cognitive dissonance happens a lot to people. In my case, when it happened, I feel like I was really fortunate because I had someone there who understood what was happening for me.
Yeah. And
who understood the idea that allyship is developmental. And that's, if your audience gets nothing else from this conversation, that's something I would love for them to understand. And what that means is this: it takes more than a witty Instagram post or an insightful Facebook post for people to go from being actively or passively engaged in oppressive and problematic behavior to being an ally.
Yeah.
There's a process that people go through. And another thing that people don't understand is that in doing this work, when you encounter cognitive ideas that cause cognitive dissonance, like that idea did for me, it's a direct challenge to your worldview.
Yeah.
That means that it challenges the way that you understand the world, the logic of the world, the values of the world, and the way the world should be. And so by extension, it challenges who you are and who you are in the world and who you think you are, who you think you should be. So it's not simply, hey, let me read this post, and the post says racism is real, and you're like, oh my God, racism is real, and then you go do all the things. That doesn't happen, right? It's a psychological and emotional process that goes along with discovering the world is not what I thought it was.
Yes.
Not only is the world not what I thought it was, I am not who I thought I was.
Yep.
So, for example, when I got so many stories.
Tell the story. I learn so much better through stories anyway, and I know the audience loves them. So feel free, keep going.
Okay, good. So I'm a fan of using myself to illustrate the points that I'm making, and so some of this stuff is really embarrassing. Like it's embarrassing to look back and think that this person who changed my life and who I adored, that I had really negative thoughts about them because of who they loved. Right? That makes to this day, it makes my skin crawl. I hate it. But it's very important because I want people to understand that part of the work that I do liberation work. I don't do anti-anything work, right? So part of the work of liberation is understanding that humans are inherently good, which is a big leap for a lot of people. And if humans are inherently good, a lot of times people are acting and behaving in the ways that they are because they are lacking information, or they have not been exposed to something, or right? So moving from there, went to the social justice program, and part of that program, it's profoundly thorough, this program. So for example, before I was ever allowed to teach anyone, I had to take an entire course on self-awareness.
God. That is amazing.
I got a story about that too. I hated that course so much. You have no idea, because I'm a dude and I don't do feelings, and that course was all about the feelings. I hated it. I did this weekend. We had to do these training weekends, right? This weekend was on sexism, and there was a man there. His name was or is, oh gosh, I can see his face. Stephen Botkin, Dr. Stephen Botkin, who is the founder of the Men's Resource Center and Men's Resources International, both of whom teach men to have better and more positive ways of being men. So Stephen was there with someone who worked in his center. The Men's Resource Center also worked with men who were abusers to help them to transform themselves, right? And to come to grips with their own violence and their history of violence and all of these things. So that weekend it just wrecked my brain for weeks afterward. There was a part of that weekend was a panel discussion, and there was a man there and a woman there. They were married, and the man was a part of the Men's Resource Center, and he was someone who was formerly abusive to his wife and kids. And this was the woman he abused. And they were there together in this workshop on sexism and misogyny talking to us. Wow. Which for me, I didn't know what to do with that. Like first of all, the courage that it takes to do that work, right? And it really altered my way of understanding a lot of stuff. So this dude was very candid and honest in talking about who he was and what he did. And he was very honest about why he did those things. And he was also very honest in saying, I'm not offering you an excuse. Yeah. I'm trying to help you understand how this happens, how men learn to be abusive toward the people they love.
I want to pause you there for a second because I've been doing a lot of reading lately on exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
And compassion is really important to me in anything I do. Mm-hmm. And I know it's like unpopular. And as you were talking, especially from the earlier context about socialization, I was thinking how we, especially as women, are really socialized to be like, screw that guy, cut him off. No, you do this. Like someone hits me, I'm out the door. And mm-hmm. I am not saying to anyone what your right or wrong should be. But like as you're talking about this, and even yesterday I was reading an article, I forget what the magazine was, but it was a conversation between Jane Fonda and Patrisse Cullors, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. And someone had commented on it. Didn't Jane Fonda just come out supporting Donald Trump? And I got on the Google machine and I started looking at that. And she wasn't supporting Donald Trump, but she was just saying like he exhibits the behaviors of the wounded. Right? People don't become this abusive. People don't become this narcissistic and all the other things that the behaviors he exhibits without having their own woundings, without being abused themselves and blah, blah, blah. And, right. you know, some people will take that as, she's supporting Donald Trump and then go screw Jane Fonda, who does so much amazing activism work. And so I'm hearing you and I want to like emphasize this for people listening that a lot of us are also socialized that when someone messes up, they're out, done. And there needs to be accountability. And it sounds like what you're saying here is there was accountability, there was repair, there was learning, there was healing. It takes a lot of work.
Well, I'm saying multiple things. I think what you're talking about is something that is very nuanced. Yeah. And I agree with you 100%. Right. So, for example, I have a course called Foundations of Social Justice. And in that course, I don't remember what I was talking about, but I was using I said to illustrate some point that I was making. I said that white people need to heal from racism. And that was sort of a shock to people in the group. Some of those people had never been exposed to the idea that not just people of color need to heal, but white people need to heal as well. So I agree. And I will say that the person I want to be careful that we do not shift all of our attention to the person who is doing the wounding, right? Right. So that the person who is being hurt in this scenario, our immediate attention must be on that person. Yeah. And on getting the help that they need and ensuring that they are safe and ensuring that they have safe spaces to process what happened and to heal and all the things that they need to do. Yeah. And the person who is doing the wounding must also have that space and opportunity. They must be held accountable for their actions 100%. So before anyone gets before you start receiving mail saying all of the things, I want to add that caveat. First and foremost, yes, they must be held accountable. Yeah. And we also know that hurt people hurt people. And so we must create space for people who are doing the hurting to unpack what has happened to them. Right. So that they can begin the process of their own self-transformation.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you for saying, like, the priority is take care of the wounded person, right? The victim in the situation, right? And it is super nuanced because the hierarchy of all these things, people put hierarchies on things. And in some cases, I think it's totally case by case and a lot in different things, not in the context of this specific conversation, because I agree with what you said. But I'm just repeating that for anyone listening. If anyone's like having a reaction to that, we are saying the first most important thing is if someone is a victim that they are taken care of. And
so 100%. And let me also add that it is not that the healing of the person who is hurting other people is not necessarily the job of the person who has been hurt. Yeah. And huge. And here's the other piece. it's not necessarily not that person's job either. So here's what I mean by that. One of the fundamental pieces of critical liberation theory is that people define for themselves what is liberatory. So for some people, getting the hell away from this person and never engaging in them, with them again, is what feels liberatory. But for other people, the process of making the person understand what they did and the impact it had, going through the process of holding them accountable, and for some people, going through a process of reconciliation, for them, that feels liberatory.
Yeah.
And so what's important for me is that we create space for people to make their own informed decisions.
Yes.
Such that if you are in a relationship with someone and there is domestic violence, you get to decide what's best. And you get to make, hopefully you get to make that decision in a place where you are safe with people who are professional helpers, right? Who can help talk you through and walk you through and all the things. The sad reality is most women don't get that opportunity.
Right.
They don't get the opportunity to A, make the decisions, and B, make the decisions in an informed way in places where they are safe.
Yep. I want to come back to something that's such an important point. Thank you so much for sharing all that and that story and about that panel.
I didn't finish the story. Actually.
Keep going then.
So part of it was this guy telling his story, but the other part was the woman telling his wife. I wish I could remember her name because she had the most impact on me. She got to tell her story and share her thoughts. And again, I don't remember all of the things because it happened decades ago. However, what I do remember is her saying that it wasn't the black eyes or the broken bones that hurt her the most. It was the words that he said, because her body's healed, but her spirit hasn't. Mm. And that just sort of broke me. You know, it broke something inside of me. I don't know what that thing was, but, you know, from that point forward, like as soon as I stepped out the door, man, and got on the bus, I just saw sexism everywhere. And I don't have the words really to articulate that, the full richness of that experience. But it was something that was transformative for me. That story was connected to a larger point. I don't remember what that point was at this point.
That's okay. This is what we do on the show. We hit the points. Sometimes we forget things. Sometimes we come back. Sometimes
let's do it.
This is why I take notes while we're talking. And you know,
fair enough.
I believe in like divine timing and divine content. We'll get to what we need to get to. But I think, well, one of the things for sure, you know, these are very complex and nuanced conversations. But I think we were talking about the difference between liberation work and anti-anything, which, you know, for me, as I've been also studying and deciding who to learn from, I gravitate much more towards liberation. The anti this, that, or the other thing stuff, the energetics around that, the languaging around a lot of it, I'm not really into it. And this is something that you and I had talked about before as well, that I wanted to make sure to bring into this conversation, which is, I think, was another piece of the cognitive dissonance. That saying, and I don't know whose saying it is, that like the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house.
That would be Audre Lorde.
Thank you. And so I love when people, I'm a little OCD about attribution. And so when I can't remember something, so that really brings me a lot of joy that you knew. So, and we see this a lot, especially online, how it's like the loudest person or the person with the biggest platform, because of the way social media works, is sometimes lauded as the biggest teacher out there at the moment, but they're not necessarily the people with the most training. They haven't done a whole entire program in social justice. They haven't gone through unpacking all of their own stuff. And in some ways, we see people almost weaponizing things like emotional labor, other people's fragility. And again, these are also nuanced and complex things. But you did have some opinions on that.
I did. So I don't want to get up on an elitist high horse and say you can't do. Well, first let's. Man, so there are two different points you talked about.
Yeah.
The first is the difference between, let's say, anti-oppression work and liberation work, and then the second is how this conversation is happening in the social media space.
Yeah.
So let's take the second one first, how this conversation is happening. So social media, well, first of all, any conversation on social justice and liberation is by default going to be a very, very complex conversation, no matter which piece of that conversation you decide to engage in. And I think it's very important to note that social media is not designed to facilitate complex conversations.
This is like the highlight, like not designed for complex conversations. Keep going.
So what you wind up with is these little interesting and fascinating and articulate sound bites that, without a broader context, seem to be profound in and of themselves. And yes, they are profound thoughts, and usually they are profound individual thoughts without all of the caveats that go with it, right? Or without all of the accompanying nuance or all of the necessary context to fully understand and fully grasp what's happening. And so people respond to that in a similar fashion, with a single thought or with a diatribe based on that single thought, or and. The point is this, that you cannot have complex conversations about this stuff consistently and in ways that lead developmentally to people progressing, because that's not what the medium is designed for. That being said, certainly the way that the conversation is being had is, in my eyes, it's very problematic. I do my work very differently than a lot of other people. And I am very privileged in that the people that trained me to do this work were some of the best in the business. And I say that because it's true, right? So the people of my program wrote the book that other people read to figure out how to do this work. And they were all powerful women, and I will forever be grateful about that. Because I had challenged on my man shit a lot. Let me tell you, man, it's a lot. So part of what I see happening in the way, well, first, let me also say this. It's perfectly fine that other people don't do their work the way I do my work, because the problem is big enough so that we need all kinds of people doing all kinds of work. Yeah. Right. I think the challenge is that giving a speech or dropping some knowledge or, all the sorts of things that we see happening on social media is very different from engaging people in a sustained process that is designed for transformation and that is designed to help them learn the tools that are necessary for them to do this work independently, right? So metacognition, for example, the ability to think about your thinking, that can't be taught on Instagram, or positionality, or perspective taking, or like all of these tools that are an inherent part of doing the work can't be taught on Instagram. That means that we need sustained ways of engaging in the work and sustained opportunities to engage with each other. And you need a trained educator and facilitator who can not just create that process, but manage the process and wrap the process up. And so, and I say wrap the process up because it's really important to note that as a facilitator, it's irresponsible when you open up somebody's can of worms and then you don't close it so that they can continue to function.
Yes.
So, whenever I do this work, I do two things. I start with what's new and good. So to sort of connect with people and to contribute to the group dynamic and sort of really allow us to humanize each other through human experiences. But at the end of it, I also do what's called a present time. And what that means is this. When we begin to unpack and process our experiences around racism or sexism or youth oppression, for example, inevitably we begin to talk about our histories. Because each of us have a very deep and long history of being hurt by something. And what happens is when we dive into that experience, our attention goes to that place. And it stays there for the duration of the conversation. And so it's really important that we create a mechanism by which we can bring people's attention back to the present until such time that we can go back together in this safe space and dive back in and unpack it some more. And ultimately, this work, again, is, when you introduce these ideas and concepts and topics and theories and all of these things, you're deconstructing someone's worldview. So as a facilitator and a teacher, you need to be able to present this in a way that is done with love, care, and compassion. Mm-hmm. Right? You're pulling apart someone's worldview. You have to do that with love, care, and compassion. You have to be able to hold space for people as they fall apart. What that means is, as they see the way they see the world, that falls apart. The way they understand themselves, that falls apart. Inevitably, in all of the courses I've taught, in academia and outside of academia, people have one or more epiphanies that fundamentally change how they see the world and how they understand themselves. And you need the ability to hold space for that and to hold people while they go through their process.
Yeah.
And then you need the skills and ability to hold space for them and facilitate a process whereby they begin to rebuild. That ain't an easy thing to do. And for myself, before I was allowed to teach other people, I had a year of coursework. Some of those courses were on designing educational experiences. Some of those courses were on facilitation of experiences. Some of the stuff was on, I had to shadow other trained facilitators so that I could watch them do what they're doing. Yeah. And we all sat around and we analyzed it. I had to do a course on self-awareness so that I understood what my issues were before I engage with other people so that my stuff doesn't come out and sort of smush them, right? I have a lot of anger toward white people. Cool. I need to know that so that when I'm facilitating, I can check in with myself, know when I'm getting angry and address my own shit so that I'm not bashing on the heads of the people in front of me, right? So all I'm saying is that for me and the way that I was taught, there was an extensive amount of training that went into understanding how to create and facilitate spaces where people learn and progress and grow, whether they're actively doing oppressive stuff or passively doing oppressive stuff, right? Either one. I've learned to work with those folks and carry them through a process where transformation occurs. And there are some people who are doing this work who haven't had that training, and it's very obvious. And that's not the way that I was trained is not the only way to do this work.
Yeah.
And saying that, there's just, from a facilitator perspective, there's just certain things you don't do.
Yeah.
And when you teach and facilitate in a way where people that have entrusted you to their learning, with their learning, leave and feel further damaged by the work they've done with you, you're not doing the work correctly. As a matter of fact, I would consider that malpractice, right?
Yeah.
People don't leave my courses needing to go to therapy because of something I did. You may go to therapy because of something you realize, but not because of the way that I taught my course.
Yeah.
So I think, I think the point that you made earlier is very important, which is this. Be careful about who you choose to be your teacher.
Yeah.
And trust your instincts. If your instincts are telling you that something's not right here, It could be your fragility speaking. Absolutely 100%. And it could be other stuff speaking as well.
Quick break in the show to give you a Patreon update. I am loving the platform over there. Some of you know, and some of you are already members over at patreon.com/Elizabeth Untamed. But if you don't know what it's all about, it's this amazing platform that lets artists and creatives and activists and other kinds of entrepreneurs share their work in an exclusive way with fans and followers and people who just want to get access to specific things. So what I post over at Patreon are Wild Soul Movement practice videos, 2 bonus podcast episodes a month, which are very similar to the Sunday sermons for those of you who used to enjoy those. And as well, I recently added a tier for those who are interested in just getting my stand-up comedy clips and videos from shows and open mics and ideas and feedback on premises and punchlines and things that I'm working on as I develop as a stand-up comedian. So it's super fun. The first official show I did a few weeks ago was called Does This Make Me Look Spiritual? And I went all in on my experiences living in a New Age hippie community in San Diego for 3 years. So that was super fun. And that full set is up and available in Patreon. So head on over to patreon.com/Elizabeth Untamed. I keep those things exclusively over there. They do not get posted publicly in full anywhere on the internet other than Patreon. So if you're interested in that stuff, head on over to check it out. And now back to the show. Everything you just said, I appreciate and value so much as a person who clean and amazing facilitation is one of the things I cherish and geek out on the most. And I don't know that I've ever articulated before, I believe obviously open and close a container, which is what you just described, just in different language. Mm-hmm. But the thing that you just said about someone might have to go to therapy after because of something they realized, not because of how I handled them or I interacted with them in the experience. And I just have seen, and again, to go to your point, that social media is not really built to be the place to be doing the work, especially publicly on social media. It's one thing, online is different, right? Where there's a closed group and there's a space, that is different than people who might be doing a challenge on Instagram that's public and everyone's unpacking shame and things that are bringing up the dark, and then they're being almost shamed or berated for how they're doing their own unpacking process. Mm-hmm. That is really, I see it as dangerous. Mm-hmm. And you're saying, and I'm with you always, that there's not a right or wrong way. There's certainly ways I personally believe are more effective. That also
not a right or wrong way of facilitating.
Doing the work.
I would. This is one of those nuanced things. I would certainly say there's definitely some wrong ways of doing this work, and I've seen it, and I've talked to people who've experienced it, and it's damaging because this type of work, in order to move forward, it requires you to be extremely vulnerable.
Yeah.
It requires you to face some very unpleasant truths about yourself, about your family, about your mama, about all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And if you have a calloused or careless or untrained facilitator who is not working with these things appropriately, it further embeds a lot of the things that you're struggling with.
So let me edit my point. Okay. Right or wrong is actually not what you said. You said there's no one way.
Right.
Not just one way. So let me retract that statement and put that back in, because the point you're making here, I did not say that the right way. Keep going.
I think I might have forgot my point.
No, you were saying untrained facilitator. There are right and wrong ways to do it.
Right, there definitely are. So if you're unpacking shame, for example, and shame is an inherent part of internalized oppression, right? Mm-hmm. Any targeted group that you pick one, right? Young people, old people, women, people of color, gay people, all of them have an experience of shame because it's one of the fundamental tools of oppression. And so doing liberation work with people who are targeted at some point requires that you unpack shame. And so if people are unpacking shame and you as a facilitator are being careless in the way that you do that work with them, or you're not visibly and audibly demonstrating compassion and holding space for people, or God forbid, if you shame them while they're talking about shame, it will have the impact of further and deeper embedding shame that is already existing.
Yeah.
And yes, there is a thing about having shame about shame is real. Mm-hmm. That's a thing, right? So again, there's not one way to do this work, but whatever way you're doing the work, I'm saying you to address issues of liberation and oppression and all of the stuff that goes with that. You have to commit to doing the work. It's not enough to have read the books, right? It's not enough to have to give a rousing talk and to have 1 million Instagram followers. Those things mean nothing if, as a practitioner, your skill set is lacking.
Yeah. You had said that the people who trained you wrote the book that people read. What is the book? I mean, I know there's probably 1 million, but specifically in that sentence, what book were you talking about?
I was talking about a book called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. Mm-hmm. The first edition was 1997. There's also a book called Readings for Diversity and Social Justice. They're both in their third. Readings is in its fourth edition.
Is it like sitting there on your desk? Is that what you're looking at?
It is.
For anyone who's listening, he's like, as he's saying it, he's like looking off into the corner, and I'm like, it's right there, isn't it?
Yeah, because like literally all of the people in that book, I know each one of them and I've worked with each one of them. And the theory that is taught, the method that is taught in this book is a method that generations of graduate students and professors have developed together. The program that I intended is extremely unique in a whole bunch of ways. We co-created theory. So in other words, there was space in the way that we were taught to disagree and to create new ways of thinking and new ways of learning and new ways of teaching about the things that we were teaching about. It would not be unusual at all in a class setting where a professor would present something and then as a group we get into a discussion about it, and by the end of that discussion we wind up with a new tool that we created as a group. And so what those books represent is sort of the distillation of all of those processes, and it's phenomenal.
That is amazing.
Yeah, and so that's a book that a lot of people, well, in academia anyway, a lot of people read to learn about how to do this work.
I appreciate this so much. You said something the last time we talked about surviving the environments that are consistently hurting us, because, everyone has some kind of like mixture of both privilege and disadvantage.
Right. So those might have been two different points. So a part of critical liberation theory is the development of liberatory consciousness. And so liberatory consciousness is a way of living with awareness and intentionality in a world that is full of and or characterized by oppression and oppressive systems, right? So what that means is this. Liberatory consciousness allows us to be in the oppression, but not of the oppression.
Yeah.
It allows us to be aware that oppression is real, to be aware that it is happening all around us, to be aware that it's impacting us and the people we love, and it allows us not to give in to it, right? Not to give in to hopelessness. And it teaches us to not just have a vision, but to have daily enactments of that vision, consistently moving forward toward your vision, right? And so that one of the underlying pieces of liberation, as I teach it and some of my colleagues teach it, is that with liberation, the foundation is A, humans are good, and B, it is important that we fight for something rather than against something. Yeah. And so a lot of what happens online is anti-oppression work. It's anti-racism, it's anti-sexism, and ultimately fighting against something is never as powerful as fighting for something. And fighting against something, for me anyway, when I fight for something and when I fight against something, it changes how I do the work. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a vision of what liberation looks like, and you're clear and it's articulated and you understand that vision, that means in order to have integrity, you have to act in ways that are in consistent alignment with that vision. So I'll give you an example. I have a friend who, as a part of her vision, believes in radical inclusivity. And so she was talking about how to make a space more inclusive using that value. And then she said, and for people who are transphobic or homophobic, they can just leave. They aren't welcome here. And so, she sort of went on for a little bit. And so I asked her, is it radically inclusive to exclude people who disagree with you? Right.
Exactly. The silence drops. What did she say?
She said, damn it, I hate you. And so we had this whole conversation on what it means to be radically inclusive and what it means to work with people who disagree with you.
Yeah.
And I wasn't trying to make her do one thing or the other. But what I was trying to get her to understand is that you have a value that you believe in. Mm-hmm. But your behavior right now is not in alignment with that value.
Yeah.
So what might it look like if it were? Because the fact of the matter is, again, I wasn't always the person I am now. And there's one more thing I want your audience to understand. You're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
I've been doing this work a long time. I've taught undergrad, I've taught grad, I've taught seminars, workshops all over the place. And guess what? I still make mistakes.
Yeah.
You're going to make mistakes, period. And so the question as a community who's doing this work is, how do we address people who make mistakes? Because if we're going to get rid of them, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. Because I know I've done some sexist things and heterosexist things and homophobic things. But my community didn't throw me away when I made those mistakes.
Yes.
They sat with me and said, hey, man, listen, what you just did was messed up. Here's why. Boom, 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 boom. And we engaged in an informed dialogue. And I evolved. And I did the same thing for them when it came to issues of race, when it came to issues of class. Same thing. Here's what you did. Here's why it was problematic. Here's the repercussions of that. Now let's dialogue.
Yeah. So based on that, for me personally, just as I do my own work, and, as I host conversations and I talk about things, or I'll share something online and I'll have people either commenting on my threads or sending me DMs. My rule for engagement is just that someone is listening. Someone can actually hear me in the moment. You know what I mean? Because in terms of just time and energy, emotional labor is a consideration for some people. If someone's just coming at you and not even trying to, when those people said, hey, you made a mistake, or this was problematic, or, this doesn't fly, you were and here's why, you were listening to the here's why part. This is one of the things that I find challenging is people who can't or won't hear you. So I'm curious, your context is different. So maybe not in the context, you're in a class, in a course, you're not kicking people out of the course.
I
right?
have.
Have you?
Oh, hell yeah.
Oh, for what?
Listen, so first, what you're talking about right now is active listening. Yeah. And it's one of this is one of the tools that I was mentioning earlier that people need to learn in order to do this work in a substantive way.
Yeah.
Because most people think they know how to clearly communicate, and most people think they know how to listen.
Right.
However, A, that ain't true. And then B, when it comes to issues like this, people listen just long enough to hear what they need to hear to disagree. So active listening is a fundamental tool of doing this work, and it takes a lot of practice.
Yeah.
Right? So this is another reason why, again, you can't do this work on Instagram. It's not just about content. There are skills that you have to develop in order to do the work. There are things that you need to unpack in your own history. There are beliefs that are both conscious and unconscious that you hold that you need to dissect. There are patterns in your life that are present, that are based on that beliefs, that are in operation without your awareness. And you need to become aware of those. You need to unpack them. You need to figure out where they came from. You need to figure out the belief that is behind them. And you need to contradict that belief and then go back up and rebuild all of the stuff that we just tore down.
Yeah.
It is hard. It's extensively challenging. And absolutely, I've kicked people out of my class. I've kicked people out of my courses. I've kicked people out of my online courses. I ain't got a problem with that. When it becomes clear that you are here to be a problem, then for me, my first reaction in situations of that is harm reduction. Like, while I am present, you are not going to do things to harm the people around me.
Yes.
I will circle back to you, and you and I will have a one-on-one conversation. And I would tell you what is acceptable. I will tell you what is unacceptable. I will tell you what you did. I will tell you why what you did is unacceptable. I will give you some alternatives, and then we'll start a dialogue after I've laid out all of those things. And the reason I do it that way is because in my role as a facilitator, I have a responsibility. There are people who have entrusted their stuff, their emotional processes, their intellectual processes, their safety around both of those issues to me. And I take that obligation very seriously. And so, again, if you're someone who is not listening, who is not obeying the ground rules that we develop as a community, right? That's one of the most important aspects of doing this work. How do we want to be together? And once we decide that, then let's be that. And if you can't do that, and if I call you out and say, hey, man, or hey, sister, let's check this out, let's do some, I call it a process check, where basically I stop the process and initiate a different process that is aimed at helping people to understand what's going on in the group. Right?
Yeah.
So, and what have I kicked people out for? Not controlling themselves and their temper, being belligerent, or being unnecessarily obstinate in ways that are insulting and unproductive.
Yeah.
And unwillingness to engage the processes that I've created to the point where you're being disruptive to other group members.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. For me, it's not personal. When it comes to conflict, I rarely get personal until I do. Which,
we all have our lines.
But generally speaking, I understand that this work is hard, and people got triggers all over the place.
Yep.
All over the place. And the thing about members of dominant groups is that our triggers are based in dominance. Mm-hmm. So, that's why, for example, when dominant groups lose privilege, it feels like oppression.
Yeah.
For that reason specifically. Like, I remember in Boston, is it Boston or Chicago? In one of these cities, there was this thing where they were interrupting the nepotism of the fire department and really sort of opening up and creating an egalitarian process. And I remember this one dude saying, they're taking our jobs. He's a white dude. And his grandfather was a firefighter, and his father was a firefighter, right? And he's a firefighter. And so our jobs, right, this publicly funded position that he got through nepotism belonged to him and belonged to people like him, right? Such that when that privilege was corrected and it was an egalitarian process was created, to him, it felt oppressive, and it was a trigger.
Right. I love this. Here's what I really appreciate about everything we talked about in this conversation. We probably could have gone down each thread for another hour at least on each thing, if not hours. But just your thoroughness and your attention to like, wait, tweak that. Like, appreciate that so much. It leaves space for like the individual everything, right? Because it is so complex, traumas, triggers, where they come from, but then also, you know, keeps the eye on the prize, which is the liberation, which is, you know, everyone's liberation, not just one group, not just this, and all the different. We didn't specifically talk about intersectionality, but this whole conversation was about intersectionality. We'll have to have you come back and do that one. To a degree, right?
I'll say one quick thing about intersectionality. Yep. Most people misunderstand it, largely because they haven't read Kimberly Crenshaw's work. And Kimberly Crenshaw's work, generally speaking, she's an academic. And, you know, her work is mostly read by academics. And it tends to be misunderstood as a theory of identity when it's a theory of oppression and the experience of oppression. And it is a theory that is grounded in the experience of Black queer women. That's where intersectionality emerges from. So what happens is that origin of the work and the way that that group of people informs the concept of intersectionality gets lost. It becomes appropriated by sort of mainstream white academics who leave out all the other stuff and say, hey, we all have multiple identities. That's a piece of it, but you're missing her larger point. So in terms of unpacking intersectionality, y'all, there's a ton of resources online where you can get a deeper and more understanding of what intersectionality means and why it's important that we talk about the experiences of Black women and Black queer women as it pertains to this concept and theory.
So let's wrap up with this, because I do remember I've had more than one person on the show mention intersectionality, and clearly I still have a gap in my understanding because I was using like the sweeping generalization of the idea of like how many different intersections there are. Is there a better term that doesn't appropriate Kimberly Crenshaw's original work? Does that make sense?
Yes, I do. Oh man, this is You might get some mail about this. Oh man. All right, I'm trying to think of how to say this without somebody getting upset, but I don't think there's a way to say it without somebody getting upset.
And you know what? Our audience is trained that, especially around these conversations, we want the feedback and offer it just with kindness. Even if you're angry, I don't need to tone police people. Right? Say it however you want to say it, but just have some kindness. Like when you send it, know that like we are active listening and we are like we want the feedback. So if someone doesn't like it, it's okay, and message us, and like we're listening and we're here for it. So like there's no need to be a jerk about it.
So wait, what was your original question? Is there a better term? So here's the thing.
Or better or different, just so we're not appropriating intersectionality that had this specific origin to describe other things, is what I'm asking.
So I think that term works if you understand the origin of it and if you understand the larger point, right? Yeah. Because the way that intersectionality gets talked about now is it's talked about to illustrate the ways that people have multiple identities.
Right.
But what gets lost in that conversation is that each intersection of an identity creates a unique experience of oppression.
Yeah.
And that each intersection has a multiplicative effect. In other words, if we're talking about Black women, we're talking about racism, we're talking about sexism, and we're talking about racism times sexism.
Yeah. Those are three very different things. And Black women are dealing with all of those things simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the other piece of that. How can I put this? So if racism and whiteness in general posits that white people are the pinnacle of humanity, right? White people are good. White people are awesome. Like that's mythology has to be contrasted against something in order to exist. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
So if whiteness is the thing is the top, is the most beautiful, then what it is contrasted against is blackness. If whiteness is the pinnacle of civilization, blackness is savagery. If whiteness is the pinnacle of beauty, blackness is the pinnacle of ugliness. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it sucks.
And so it's not, and I'm not taking anything away from the oppression that is experienced and the racism that is experienced from other racial groups.
Right.
I'm saying that in America, in the racism in the United States, that's the way this is set up.
Yeah.
And so that applies to other forms of oppression as well. And so if men are the pinnacle of power, women are the pinnacle of weakness. Right? If cisgendered folks are the pinnacle of what we should all strive to be in terms of gender, if you're genderqueer in any kind of way, you are the exact opposite. So what happens then when you have an experience in which the thing that is contrasted against dominance gets concentrated in one place? That experience, that intersection of oppression is what Black queer women deal with.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is the place where Kimberly Crenshaw began to do her initial theorizing around intersectionality.
Yeah.
That experience. And people don't know, quite frankly, don't know enough about Black women and Black queer women to really grasp the idea that these intersections create fundamentally new experiences of oppression. So, and honestly, like, we can go on and on and on and on and on about this. My larger point is this, that intersectionality, as it pertains to intersection of identity, it's the way that the term has both been appropriated and the way that the concept has evolved. That's a piece of it.
Yeah.
I'm encouraging people to not stop there and to do their own investigations into this concept of intersectionality so that they understand the origins of it, understand what Kimberly Crenshaw was working on when she started this work. Then you'll have a full understanding of the concept. And
that is what I was looking for. You're saying how it has the origins and then also how it's evolved. That hits the nail on the head for me in terms of like what I was curious about. So just like when I speak about it, I could speak about it properly with giving credit where it is due. This was so amazing. I feel like I'm going to go back and listen to this conversation like 4 times. Often on the show, when we get into like nuanced and complex stuff, I'll tell people, listen 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 times. The most I've ever had someone tell me they listened to an interview was 8 times. So maybe this is an 8-time listener, folks who are listening.
There's a lot here, definitely.
There's a lot here. Check out, what is your website? I know all of your social handles and everything is I am, as in like the letter I, the letter M, Dr. T, DRTEE, Instagram, all the other places. And then website and all that other stuff. Where do you want people to find you?
Website is also I'm Dr. T, IMDRTEE.com. And it's my website is a work in progress, y'all. So, like, be gentle.
Whose isn't?
Right, exactly. You'll find there my Foundations of Social Justice course. If you found all of this stuff interesting, that course is sort of a really deep dive into all of these things in a more thorough way. Yeah. All the nuances are there, which is awesome. Then I also have a very cool social justice sci-fi book club, which, strangely enough, Sci-Fi, if you're a fan, tackles social justice issues in this really intense and phenomenal way. So we talk about social justice specifically within those genres. And our last 4 books have been women of color, and they've talked about genocide and sexual assault and genital mutilation and like
so light stuff.
Oh, it's not light at all, man. Let me tell you. But it's an amazing way to learn about social justice issues and group dynamics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Super interesting. Well, thank you so much. This is episode number 279. So for anyone listening, all those links, everything will be, the show notes will be at untameyourself.com/TT-279. I will not keep you any longer. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Mucho. And we'll see you later.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.